Deep beneath the streets of modern Rome, hidden in the valley between the Esquiline and Caelian hills, lie the weathered remains of a place where men were forged into fighters. The Ludus Magnus, once the greatest gladiator training school in the ancient world, sits just east of the Colosseum, connected to that magnificent arena by an underground passage. Walk through those ancient corridors today, and you can almost hear the echoes of wooden swords clashing, the grunts of men pushing their bodies to the absolute limit, the sharp commands of trainers preparing their charges for the most dangerous performances in human history. But to understand these fighters, to truly grasp what it meant to be a gladiator in ancient Rome, we need to go back further. Much further. We need to travel to a time when Rome itself was still finding its identity, borrowing customs and traditions from the older civilizations that surrounded it on the Italian peninsula. The ancient roots of blood sport. The year is 264 BC, and the great Roman politician Junius Brutus has just died. His sons, Marcus and Decimus, are preparing to honor their father's memory. In the Forum Boarium, a commercial district named for the cattle market that operated there, they've arranged something unusual. 3 pairs of slaves will fight to the death. This isn't entertainment, not in the way we might think of it. This is a funeral rite, a blood offering to ensure the departed soul has armed attendants in the afterlife. The origins of this practice remain shrouded in uncertainty, debated by scholars both ancient and modern. The Roman author Livy, writing centuries after these events, believed the tradition came from Campania, a region south of Rome where Greek colonists had settled. According to Livy, the Campanians began staging these fights around 310 BC to celebrate military victories over their archenemies, the Samnites. They dressed captured slaves in Samnite armor and weapons, forcing them to fight to the death as a form of symbolic domination over their defeated foes. Other ancient writers pointed further north, to Etruria, that mysterious civilization that had such profound influence on early Rome. The Etruscans, who dominated central Italy before Rome's rise, associated combat with death rituals and the journey to the underworld. In Etruscan tombs, archaeologists have found paintings depicting armed combat at funerals, dating back to the 4th century BC. The Etruscans had a psychopomp named Charun, who guided souls to the underworld. And during Roman gladiatorial games, an attendant dressed as Charon would ritually strike down defeated gladiators, maintaining that ancient connection to death and the afterlife. The Greek historian Nicholas of Damascus, writing in the late 1st century BC, firmly believed these contests were Etruscan in origin. He understood them as human sacrifices, offerings of blood meant to appease the spirits of the dead. The word itself, gladiator, comes from gladius, the short sword used by Roman legionaries, but the practice was anything but Roman in its inception. What we can say with certainty is that these early munera, as the Romans called them, were private affairs. The word munus means an offering or duty, something obligatory that wealthy families owed to their deceased patriarchs. That first contest in 264 BC, organized by the sons of Brutus, featured just 3 pairs of fighters. Modest by later standards, almost intimate. The combatants were likely prisoners of war or purchased slaves, men whose lives held little value in Roman society and could therefore be expended in this ritual bloodletting. For the next several decades, gladiatorial combat remained a relatively small-scale practice, confined to funeral rites for important aristocrats. The fights didn't have to occur immediately at death. Julius Caesar would later stage games to honor his father 20 years after the man had died. But gradually, imperceptibly at first, something began to change. The religious significance started to fade, replaced by something more calculating, more political. The Romans, ever practical, recognized that these blood spectacles had a power beyond the spiritual. They could move crowds, win favor, demonstrate wealth and influence. The Republican era, politics and blood. By 216 BC, the scale had already begun to expand. When Marcus Aemilius Lepidus died, his sons honored him with 3 days of gladiatorial games in the Forum Romanum, featuring 22 pairs of fighters. The Forum Romanum, the political and commercial heart of Rome, was a far more public venue than the cattle market where the first games had been held. This shift in location reflected a shift in purpose. The games were becoming spectacle, entertainment, a way for powerful families to display their wealth and win public approval. The Roman Republic, that complex system of checks and balances designed to prevent any one man from accumulating too much power, found itself increasingly unable to regulate these displays. The games were useful to ambitious politicians. Stage an impressive munus, and the common people would remember your generosity when it came time to vote. Provide enough gladiators, enough blood, enough spectacle, and you could build a political career on the corpses of slaves and prisoners. By the time of Julius Caesar, gladiatorial games had become an essential tool of political manipulation. In 65 BC, serving as aedile, Caesar staged games to honor his father who had died 20 years earlier. He provided 320 pairs of gladiators, each outfitted in silver armor that glinted in the Roman sun. The historian Pliny the Elder tells us the sight was spectacular, a display of wealth so ostentatious it alarmed the Senate. The military strongman Spartacus had led his famous rebellion just 8 years earlier, and the Senate remembered all too well how dangerous trained fighters could be. They passed legislation limiting the number of gladiators any single person could maintain in Rome. But such laws proved difficult to enforce against popular politicians with the mob's support. Caesar understood something fundamental about Roman society. The people wanted bread and circuses, panem et circenses, feed them and entertain them, and they'd forgive almost anything. His lavish games weren't just about honoring the dead or demonstrating wealth. They were about building a power base that transcended the traditional structures of republican government. The gladiators in their silver armor were billboards advertising Caesar's magnificence, his generosity, his fitness to lead. Other politicians followed his example. Pompey the Great, Caesar's rival and later enemy, staged games featuring battles between men and exotic animals brought from the far reaches of Rome's expanding empire. In one particularly grotesque display, he had 600 lions killed. The crowds loved it. They roared their approval as the great cats died, and Pompey's reputation grew. This was the late Republic, when the old certainties were crumbling, when ambitious men were discovering that personal loyalty to a charismatic leader could matter more than loyalty to abstract principles of republican government. The games themselves were evolving. In the beginning, fighters had used whatever weapons were available, often the captured arms and armor of defeated enemies. But over time, distinct gladiator types began to emerge, each with specialized equipment and fighting styles. The Samnite gladiator, named for those enemies Rome had fought and subdued in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, wore heavy armor, and carried a large rectangular shield, a short sword, and a visored helmet with a distinctive plume. They represented Rome's conquest of central Italy, a living reminder of Roman military superiority. The recruitment of gladiators followed certain patterns. Most were slaves, purchased specifically for the purpose, or condemned criminals given the choice between the mines and the arena. The mines were a death sentence drawn out over months or years of grinding labor. The arena offered at least the possibility of survival, of glory, perhaps even eventual freedom. Some gladiators were prisoners of war, captured soldiers from defeated peoples. These men often became gladiators of specific types associated with their homeland. Thracian warriors became Thraex gladiators, using the curved Sika sword of their people. Gauls became Gallus gladiators, heavily armored in the style of warriors from that region. But here's something remarkable that sets Rome apart from virtually every other slave society in history. Some gladiators were volunteers, free men, sometimes even from the upper classes, who signed contracts to fight in the arena. The proportion of volunteers remains debated among scholars, though some ancient sources and modern historians suggest voluntary fighters may have represented a substantial portion of gladiators by the height of the imperial period, perhaps even approaching half. These volunteers were called octorati. They swore an oath, binding themselves to their lanista, the owner of the gladiator school. The oath was brutal in its honesty. According to the Roman satirist Petronius, they swore to endure to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. Why would free men do this? Money was certainly part of it. Successful gladiators could earn substantial prize money. But there was more. Roman society valued martial prowess above almost everything else. The gladiator, despite being socially marginalized, embodied Roman virtues of courage, discipline, and skill in combat. There was a paradox here that the Christian writer Tertullian would later highlight. Romans simultaneously glorified and degraded gladiators, celebrating their courage while excluding them from political participation, admiring their skill while barring them from respectable society. The crowd's relationship with gladiators was complex, tinged with the same complicated emotions modern audiences might feel toward boxers or mixed martial arts fighters. They were celebrities, their images appearing on pottery, oil lamps, and wall paintings throughout the Roman world. Women of all social classes were said to be fascinated by them, though respectable women would never openly admit such attraction. Some gladiators became genuine stars, their names known throughout Italy, their victories recorded in graffiti on city walls. The revolt that changed everything. In 73 BC, something happened that would forever alter how Romans viewed gladiators and the institutions that trained them. At a gladiator school in Capua, owned by a man named Lentulus Batiatus, a Thracian fighter named Spartacus was planning something unprecedented. The sources disagree on his background. Some say he was a captured soldier. Others claim he had once been a Roman auxiliary before deserting. What we know for certain is that he was charismatic, intelligent, and absolutely unwilling to accept his fate. Spartacus and about 70 other gladiators broke out of the school, seizing kitchen knives and skewers as weapons. They fought their way free and fled to the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. The Roman authorities, accustomed to quickly suppressing slave rebellions, sent a small force to deal with what they assumed would be a minor disturbance. Spartacus and his men ambushed and destroyed this force, capturing their military equipment in the process. Word of the victory spread like wildfire through the slave populations of southern Italy. Runaway slaves, field workers, gladiators from other schools, they all flocked to Spartacus's banner. Within months, he commanded an army of tens of thousands. They weren't a mob. Spartacus, using his military training, organized them into disciplined units. They defeated Roman army under Roman army, shocking the Republic to its core. The rebellion lasted for 2 years, from 73 to 71 BC. The gladiator army ravaged southern Italy, defeating multiple Roman legions. Spartacus attempted to lead his followers north, perhaps hoping to cross the Alps and return to their homelands. But circumstances and internal divisions among the rebels prevented this. Eventually, Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest men and an ambitious politician, was given command of 8 legions. He pursued Spartacus relentlessly, cornering the rebel army in southern Italy. The final battle was brutal. Spartacus, seeing his cause was lost, reportedly tried to fight his way through to Crassus himself, hoping to kill the Roman commander in single combat. He never made it. The gladiator leader fell, buried under the press of Roman soldiers. His body never identified among the thousands of corpses. Crassus ordered 6,000 captured rebels crucified along the Appian Way, the main road from Rome to Capua. For miles, travelers could see the bodies of slaves hanging from crosses, a graphic reminder of the fate awaiting those who challenged Roman authority. The Spartacus revolt had profound effects on how Rome managed gladiatorial training. The Senate passed laws restricting private ownership of gladiator schools, limiting their size and regulating their location. The schools themselves became more secure, more like prisons. The lesson was clear. Trained fighters were dangerous, and their training needed to be carefully controlled. No longer would gladiator schools be purely private enterprises. Increasingly, they came under state oversight, and eventually, many would be directly operated by the imperial government. Yet the games themselves didn't diminish. If anything, they grew larger and more elaborate. The late Republic saw Munera becoming increasingly divorced from their funeral origins. They were now primarily entertainment, spectacles staged by politicians to win favor and demonstrate their wealth. The religious elements remained, vestigial reminders of the practice's origins, but the primary purpose was political theater, the imperial evolution of the games. When Octavian, later known as Augustus, emerged victorious from the civil wars that destroyed the Roman Republic, he found himself ruling an empire in everything but name. He called himself Princeps, first citizen, and carefully maintained the fiction that he was simply restoring the Republic rather than establishing a monarchy. But in reality, Augustus wielded power no Republican magistrate had ever possessed, and he understood that power needed spectacle to maintain itself. Augustus formalized the gladiatorial games, transforming them from private political tools into state functions that reinforced imperial authority. He regulated them carefully, limiting private munera and establishing that the greatest games would be sponsored by the emperor himself or conducted in his name. The gladiatorial combat became part of the imperial cult, those religious ceremonies that elevated the emperor to divine status. To attend the games was to participate in a civic and religious ritual, acknowledging the emperor's position as the god's representative on earth. He limited private spending on games, ostensibly to prevent wealthy citizens from bankrupting themselves, but really to ensure that no private individual could compete with imperial magnificence. An imperial praetor could sponsor games with up to 120 gladiators, at a maximum cost of 25,000 denarii. Imperial games could cost 180,000 denarii or more. The message was unmistakable. Only the emperor could provide truly spectacular entertainment, and therefore, only the emperor deserved the people's primary loyalty. The games themselves reached new heights of elaboration under the emperors. Titus, celebrating the dedication of the Colosseum in 80 AD, staged 100 days of games. Trajan, celebrating his victory over the Dacians in 107 AD, had 5,000 pairs of gladiators fight. These weren't just combat matches. They were multimedia spectacles featuring exotic animals, elaborate stage sets, mythological reenactments, and even mock naval battles in flooded arenas. The types of gladiators continued to evolve throughout the imperial period. As Rome absorbed new territories, the gladiator types that had been named for defeated enemies became politically problematic. You couldn't have Gaulish gladiators after Gaul became a peaceful, integrated province of the empire. The Samnis, named for the Samnites, was phased out and replaced by the Murmillo, a similar heavily armed fighter whose name came from a type of fish rather than a conquered people. New specialized types emerged to increase the variety of combat. The Retiarius, the net fighter, became popular during the 1st century AD. Lightly armored and armed with just a weighted net, a trident, and a dagger. The Retiarius represented a complete contrast to heavily armored fighters. Watching a fast, mobile Retiarius battle a slow but heavily protected Secutor provided exactly the kind of dynamic, unpredictable combat that Roman audiences craved. The pairing of gladiator types became an art form in itself. Organizers carefully matched fighters to create interesting tactical situations. A Murmillo with his large shield and short sword might face a Thrax with his small shield and curved blade, creating a contest between defense and agility. A Retiarius might fight a Secutor specially designed to counter the net fighter's tactics, with a smooth, rounded helmet that the net couldn't easily snag. The development of the Secutor, which means pursuer or chaser, demonstrates how gladiatorial combat evolved as a sport. The Secutor was essentially a modified Murmillo, designed specifically to fight the Retiarius. His helmet completely enclosed his head, with only 2 small eye holes. This protected him from the Retiarius's trident jabs, but severely restricted his vision and air supply. The helmet was smooth and rounded, preventing the net from catching on decorative features. The Secutor represented specialization, the development of a gladiator type to counter another type's tactics. Much as modern combat sports develop techniques to counter specific fighting styles. Women occasionally fought as gladiators too, though they were rare and controversial. Female gladiators, called gladiatrices, first appear in the historical record around the 1st century AD. A marble relief from the 2nd century shows 2 women, nicknamed Amazon and Achillea in the inscription, who fought to an honorable draw. The Roman satirist Juvenal mocked upper-class women who trained as gladiators, suggesting it had become something of a fad among certain wealthy women seeking thrills. The Emperor Septimius Severus banned female gladiators around 200 AD, apparently finding their participation distasteful. Though whether this ban was effectively enforced remains unclear. The Brotherhood of the Arena. Inside the gladiator schools, life followed rhythms quite different from the spectacular violence of the arena. The ludi, as these schools were called, were complex institutions combining aspects of prisons, military barracks, and athletic training facilities. They were brutal places, make no mistake. But they weren't simply death camps. The men confined there received medical care, regular meals, and systematic training. They had to. A gladiator represented a substantial investment for his owner, and dead gladiators earned no money. The largest and most famous of these schools was the Ludus Magnus in Rome, built by the Emperor Domitian in the late 1st century AD. Located just east of the Colosseum, it housed up to 2,000 gladiators at its peak. The complex was rectangular, built around a central training arena measuring about 63 meters by 42 meters. This practice arena was surrounded by seating that could accommodate approximately 3,000 spectators. Romans didn't just watch the games. They watched the training too, coming to the Ludus Magnus to see their favorite fighters prepare, to assess form and fitness before placing bets on upcoming matches. An underground tunnel connected the Ludus Magnus directly to the Colosseum's hypogeum, the maze of passages and chambers beneath the arena floor. On the day of the games, gladiators would walk through this tunnel, emerging into the sunlight and the roar of 50,000 voices without ever appearing on the streets of Rome. This wasn't just convenient, it was strategic. A gladiator walking through the streets might be attacked by enemies, or might attempt to escape, or might be mobbed by admirers. The tunnel eliminated these complications. The gladiators lived in small cells arranged around the training arena, cramped rooms measuring roughly 4 meters on each side. These weren't comfortable quarters. They were functional spaces designed to house men efficiently while preventing escape. Gladiators slept shackled, even the most trusted veterans. The memory of Spartacus remained fresh, and no lanista wanted his school to become the starting point of another rebellion. Daily life in the Ludus was highly regimented. Gladiators woke early, ate a communal breakfast, and then trained for hours under the supervision of specialized instructors called doctores. Each type of gladiator had his own doctor who taught the specific techniques, tactics, and fighting styles appropriate to that armature. A doctor who specialized in training retiarii would have little to teach a murmillo. The two types fought completely differently, used different equipment, employed different strategies. Training began with wooden swords and blunted weapons. Gladiators practiced against posts, learning the basic strikes and defensive movements of their type. They drilled endlessly, repeating the same motions until they became automatic, ingrained in muscle memory so deeply that in the stress of actual combat, their bodies would respond without conscious thought. The training posts, called pali, were often weighted to be heavier than an actual opponent, building strength and endurance. As gladiators progressed, they sparred against each other, still using practice weapons. Accidents happened, of course. Men were injured in training, sometimes killed. But the schools tried to minimize such losses. A gladiator injured in training couldn't fight in the arena, and a dead trainee represented a complete loss of investment. The practice weapons were blunt, the protective padding substantial. Gladiators advanced through ranks, a hierarchy that recognized skill and experience. The lowest rank was Tiro, a novice who had never fought in the arena. Above them were the experienced gladiators who had survived multiple bouts. The highest rank was Primus Paulus, first pole, reserved for master gladiators who not only fought, but also helped train others. These veterans of the arena commanded respect from their fellow gladiators and even from the lanistae who owned them. The diet of gladiators surprises many people. Modern analysis of gladiator skeletons has revealed they ate primarily vegetarian diets, heavy in beans, grains, and dried fruit. The ancient sources mention gladiators being called hordeari, barley men, because they consumed large quantities of barley and other grains. This diet provided the calories needed for intensive training while also producing a layer of fat beneath the skin. This fat layer, while making the fighters appear heavier, actually protected against shallow cuts, preventing minor wounds from severing blood vessels or penetrating to vital organs. Gladiators received regular medical attention, far better than most slaves or even many free Romans. The physician Galen, one of the most important medical practitioners in Roman history, began his career treating gladiators in Pergamum. He learned anatomy from treating their wounds, becoming so skilled that during his tenure, gladiator deaths from infection dropped dramatically. The Lanisti wanted their investments kept healthy and fighting fit. Yet for all the medical care and regular meals, the reality remained that gladiators existed to fight and likely to die. The ancient sources disagree on casualty rates, and modern scholars continue to debate the issue. Some historians have suggested 1 in 5 gladiators died in each bout, while others propose the rate might have been closer to 1 in 10. The truth likely varied considerably depending on the type of match and the period in question. Regular gladiatorial bouts, fought between trained professionals, had relatively low death rates. Both fighters represented substantial investments, and the lanista who owned them wanted them to survive. Matches between novices or involving condemned criminals were far more likely to end in death. The relationship between gladiators was complicated. They were brothers in arms, bound together by shared danger and the knowledge that few others understood what they experienced. Ancient sources mention gladiators forming collegia, something like unions or professional associations, with elected leaders and shared funds to pay for proper burials if they fell. Yet they also competed against each other for fame, prize money, and the crowd's adoration. A successful gladiator might achieve a kind of immortality, his name remembered, his victories celebrated. But that success came at the expense of other gladiators he defeated and perhaps killed. Some gladiators achieved remarkable fame. Priscus and Varus, who fought at the inauguration of the Colosseum, earned their freedom when they battled for hours to a draw, impressing the Emperor Titus so much that he granted both men the rudes, the wooden sword that symbolized emancipation. Flamma, a Syrian fighter, won his freedom 4 times, but repeatedly refused it, choosing to continue fighting. He compiled a record of 21 victories, 9 draws, and 4 defeats before finally dying in the arena at age 30. The ultimate goal for any gladiator was to receive the rudes and earn freedom. Some gladiators, upon winning their freedom, continued in the profession as trainers, passing their skills to the next generation. Others disappeared into obscurity, trying to build normal lives after years of extraordinary violence. But freedom was rare. Most gladiators died before achieving it, cut down in the arena or succumbing to infections from wounds that even Galen's skill couldn't heal, the monument to dynasty and death. While gladiators trained in schools like the Ludus Magnus, an even more ambitious project was taking shape. In 69 AD, a chaotic year that saw 4 different men claim the title of emperor, Vespasian emerged victorious from the civil war. He was a different sort of emperor than his predecessors, a military man from a relatively modest background rather than an aristocrat from ancient lineage. His path to power had been unconventional, and he needed to establish his legitimacy in the eyes of the Roman people. Vespasian looked at Rome and saw a city scarred by Nero's excesses. The previous emperor had built himself a massive palace complex called the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, sprawling across much of central Rome. At its heart lay an artificial lake, a private pleasure ground for Nero, surrounded by elaborate gardens and pavilions. Nero had also erected a colossal bronze statue of himself, reportedly over 30 meters tall according to ancient descriptions, though the exact height remains debated by scholars, positioned at the entrance to his palace. These monuments to one man's ego had been built on public land, appropriated by Nero for his private use. Vespasian saw an opportunity. He would drain Nero's lake and on that very spot build something for the people of Rome rather than for one man's pleasure. He would build the largest amphitheater the world had ever seen, a monument that would serve multiple purposes. It would provide entertainment for the masses, of course, but it would also demonstrate the Flavian dynasty's commitment to public welfare. It would be a symbol of Roman power and engineering genius. And it would be a propaganda statement, a building that said more clearly than any words, the age of imperial excess for the benefit of one man is over, and the age of magnificence for the benefit of all has begun. Construction began sometime between 70 and 72 AD, with scholarly debate about the precise date. The project was funded with the spoils of war, specifically from the Jewish temple after the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. A reconstructed inscription found at the site makes this clear, though Roman records show characteristic brutality. The construction utilized enslaved Jewish prisoners, forced labor-building entertainment structures that would, ironically, be used to execute their co-religionists in years to come. The site presented significant challenges. Nero's lake basin meant the ground was waterlogged, the soil unstable. Standard foundation techniques wouldn't suffice. The builders dug deep, excavating and then laying massive concrete foundations approximately 6 meters deep in places. Roman concrete, one of the ancient world's great technological achievements, proved perfectly suited to the task. Mixed with volcanic ash called pozzolana from nearby deposits, it cured even in wet conditions and achieved remarkable durability. The structure itself pushed Roman engineering to its limits. The Colosseum, as it would later be called, measured 189 meters by 156 meters at its widest points, standing 48 meters tall. The oval design followed the pattern established by earlier amphitheaters, but on an unprecedented scale. The exterior featured 3 stories of arches, supported by semicircular columns, each story displaying a different architectural order. The lowest level used Doric columns, symbolizing strength and stability. The second level employed Ionic columns, more elaborate and decorative. The third level featured Corinthian columns, the most ornate of the classical orders. This vertical progression from simple to complex, from sturdy to decorative, represented order and hierarchy, fundamental principles of Roman society. The building materials came from quarries throughout the region. Travertine limestone, a beautiful cream-colored stone, formed the main structural components. Workers hauled over 100,000 tons of this stone from quarries at Tivoli, about 30 kilometers from Rome, building a special road for this purpose. The tufa, a lighter volcanic rock, formed secondary walls and supports. Brick-faced concrete comprised the inner structure. Marble, the most expensive material, was used for seats and decorative elements. In total, workers processed and transported hundreds of thousands of tons of stone during construction. Metal clamps and dowels held the massive blocks together. Bronze and iron fittings, 300 tons worth, secured the structure. Many of these metal elements have disappeared over the centuries, pried out by later generations who needed the material, leaving characteristic holes that now pockmark the Colosseum's surface. The Colosseum was a freestanding structure, not built into a hillside like earlier amphitheaters. This required a complex system of barrel vaults and arches to support the weight of the seating and the crowds. Roman engineers had mastered the arch, that fundamental architectural element that transfers weight downward and outward rather than straight down. By combining arches into barrel vaults and groin vaults, they created a self-supporting structure that could bear enormous weight while leaving open space below for corridors and chambers. Vespasian didn't live to see his vision completed. He died in 79 AD, reportedly with characteristic wry humor, saying, "Vai, puto deus fio." Oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god, a reference to the Roman custom of deifying deceased emperors. His son Titus continued the work, completing the upper levels and overseeing the dedication ceremony in 80 AD. The inauguration was spectacular, beyond anything Rome had previously witnessed. The historian Dio Cassius records that the celebration lasted 100 days. Over 9,000 animals were killed in the arena during this period, brought from throughout the empire and beyond. Lions from Africa, bears from northern Europe, elephants from Asia, crocodiles from Egypt. The biodiversity of 3 continents dying for Roman entertainment. The slaughter was so extensive that some species may have been driven to extinction in certain regions. Gladiatorial combat, of course, featured prominently in the inaugural games. Fighters from throughout the empire descended on Rome. The best and most famous gladiators of the age competing before the largest audience any of them had ever faced. The opening ceremony featured a mass parade, the Pompa, with the gladiators marching through the arena in their finest armor, acknowledging the emperor and the crowd before any blood was shed. Titus himself presided over much of the games, appearing in a special imperial box that offered the best view of the arena. His presence was crucial. The emperor's attendance transformed the games from mere entertainment into a civic and religious ritual. When the emperor attended, the games became an affirmation of the social order, with the ruler at its apex, distributing bread and circuses to his subjects. Domitian, who became emperor after Titus died in 81 AD, added the final touches to the Colosseum, including the hypogeum, the extensive underground network beneath the arena floor. This transformation changed how the games could be staged, allowing for elaborate special effects and surprises that earlier amphitheaters couldn't achieve. Animals and gladiators could be raised into the arena through trap doors, seemingly appearing from nowhere. Scenery could be changed between events using mechanical lifts and platforms. The hypogeum was a marvel of engineering and stagecraft. A network of tunnels and chambers. It included holding areas for animals, armories for weapons, and rooms where gladiators waited before their bouts. Ramps led down from street level, allowing animals to be herded into their cages. Numerous vertical shafts connected the hypogeum to the arena floor, each shaft containing a platform that could be raised using a system of ropes, pulleys, and counterweights operated by teams of workers below. These platforms, called pegmata, allowed for theatrical entrances. A trap door on the arena floor would open, and suddenly a lion would appear, seemingly materializing in the center of the arena. Or a gladiator might emerge through one trap door while his opponent appeared from another on the opposite side, ensuring they didn't see each other before the match began. The crowd loved these surprises, the sudden appearances and transformations that gave the games a theatrical, almost magical quality, the architecture of spectacle. The Colosseum could accommodate somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators at various points in its history. with most scholarly estimates suggesting an average capacity of around 65,000. The variance depends on how densely the crowds were packed and which historical period we're discussing. This made it by far the largest amphitheater in the Roman world, surpassing even the great amphitheaters in provincial cities like Verona and Nîmes. The seating was arranged in a complex hierarchy that perfectly reflected Roman social structure, with each level of society assigned its appropriate place. At the very bottom, closest to the arena, was the podium, a marble terrace where the emperor sat in his special box. Beside him sat the Vestal Virgins, those priestesses whose sacred duty was to maintain Rome's eternal flame. Around them sat senators, Rome's hereditary aristocracy, dressed in their togas with the distinctive purple stripe denoting their rank. These seats offered the closest view of the action, near enough to see blood splatter, to hear the clash of weapons, to smell the fear and sweat of the fighters. Above the podium came the Maenianum Primum, reserved for wealthy equestrians. These were Rome's business class, merchants and landowners rich enough to be influential, but lacking senatorial status. They sat on marble seats, comfortable enough, with a good view of the arena below. The Maenianum Secundum divided into two sections. The lower section, the Secundum Imum, was for regular Roman citizens, the free men who formed the backbone of the city's population. They sat on stone seats, less comfortable than marble, but better than nothing. The upper section, the Secundum Summum, was for the poor, for freedmen, for foreigners, for all those who had the right to attend the games but lacked the status to sit anywhere better. Their wooden seats offered the worst view, far from the action, but they could see well enough to be entertained. At the very top of the structure, standing behind wooden barriers, were women and slaves. Roman society considered both groups unfit to sit among men, relegating them to the highest, most distant positions. From up there, the gladiators must have looked like small figures, their individual features indistinguishable, though the noise of combat and the reactions of the crowd closer to the arena would have told them what was happening. This seating arrangement was enforced carefully. Guards called curators ensured that each person sat in their assigned section. To sit in a section reserved for a higher social class was an offense that could result in ejection from the games or even legal penalties. The games were entertainment, certainly, but they were also a daily reinforcement of Rome's rigid social hierarchy, a visible demonstration that everyone had their place and needed to stay in it. The Colosseum had 80 entrances at ground level, numbered to correspond with tokens distributed to spectators. Your token told you which entrance to use and which section you'd been assigned to. This system prevented bottlenecks and allowed the massive crowd to disperse quickly after the games ended. The ancient sources claimed the entire audience could exit the building in just a few minutes, though modern crowd management experts are somewhat skeptical of this claim. 2 of the 80 entrances were special. The Porta Triumphalis, or Gate of Triumph, was where victorious gladiators exited the arena. The Porta Libitinaria, named after Libitina, the Roman goddess of death and funerals, was where the dead and mortally wounded were carried out. Attendants dressed as Charon, the Etruscan death deity, would ritually strike the fallen to ensure they were truly dead. Then workers would drag the bodies through this gate to be disposed of. Above the highest seating level, the Colosseum had provisions for the Valerium, a massive retractable awning that could shade spectators from the brutal Roman sun. This wasn't a simple canvas stretched across the opening. It was a sophisticated system of fabric panels, ropes, and pulleys, requiring an entire unit of sailors from the Roman Navy to operate. These sailors, experienced in handling complex rigging on ships, were stationed in Rome specifically to manage the Colosseum's velarium. The velarium attached to wooden masts that extended upward from corbels built into the Colosseum's fourth story, that top level of the structure. When deployed, it created a kind of roof with an open center, shading the seating areas while leaving the arena floor open to the sky. This allowed for air circulation, preventing the interior from becoming unbearably hot, while protecting spectators from both sun and rain. The engineering required to support this system was extraordinary. The velarium's weight, combined with wind loads, created enormous stress on the upper structure. The fabric panels themselves, woven from hemp or flax, were massive, each weighing hundreds of pounds. The ropes connecting them to the masts and controlling their deployment weighed even more. Modern estimates suggest the entire system, when fully deployed, may have weighed somewhere in the range of 20 to 25 metric tons, though the precise figure remains uncertain. The wooden masts and the stone structure that supported them had to bear this weight while also resisting the tremendous forces generated when wind caught the fabric. The Colosseum also featured a sophisticated drainage system. The arena floor could be flooded for naumachia, the elaborate mock naval battles that were occasionally staged in the early years before the hypogeum was built. But the drainage system's primary purpose was more mundane, handling rainwater and the fluids from butchered animals. Channels beneath the arena floor collected all this liquid and directed it into Rome's sewer system, preventing the arena from becoming a reeking swamp. There were fountains throughout the structure, providing drinking water for the crowds. Archaeological evidence suggests there were also latrines, though the exact locations remain uncertain. Feeding and providing sanitation for 50,000 people required careful planning. The games often lasted all day, from morning until evening, and spectators needed access to food, water, and toilets. Food vendors circulated through the crowds, selling the ancient equivalent of stadium fare. Nuts, dried fruits, pastries, bread, wine diluted with water, even simple cooked meals. The wealthy might send slaves ahead to reserve seats and bring elaborate picnic baskets. The poor made do with whatever they could afford or went hungry. This too reinforced social distinctions, the quality of your meal matching the quality of your seat. A day of death and drama. The games followed a set pattern, a program that audiences came to expect and anticipate. The morning belonged to the Venetianes, the animal hunts. These weren't hunts in any sporting sense. They were exhibitions of Roman dominion over nature, demonstrations that Rome could command the beasts of the earth, just as it commanded human populations. The arena floor would be prepared overnight, covered with sand fresh from the Tiber's banks. The Latin word for sand is harina, which is where we get our word arena. The sand served multiple purposes. It provided better footing than bare stone, preventing both animals and fighters from slipping. It absorbed blood, keeping the arena floor from becoming dangerously slippery. And it could be raked clean between events, covering the gore of the previous spectacle so the next could begin with a fresh canvas. For the Venetianes, workers might install trees, rocks, even entire artificial landscapes, creating a simulacrum of the animals' native environments. Lions would emerge into a miniature African savanna. Bears might find themselves in a mock forest. The bestiari, specialized animal fighters, would then enter to hunt these creatures. Bestiarii were distinct from gladiators. They fought animals rather than humans, using different weapons and tactics. Some bestiari were essentially beast handlers, trained professionals who displayed their skill in confronting dangerous animals. They might demonstrate their courage by getting close to lions without weapons, using only their knowledge of animal behavior to avoid being mauled. They might wrestle bears or dodge charging bulls. Other bestiari were condemned criminals, sentenced to death by animal attack, the damnatio ad bestias. These unfortunate people had no training, no weapons, no chance of survival. They were simply led into the arena and offered to hungry predators. Roman law permitted this execution method for certain crimes, particularly those the state considered most heinous, like murder, treason, arson, or sacrilege. Christians in the years when Rome persecuted them often faced damnatio ad bestias. The deaths of condemned criminals were sometimes choreographed to reenact mythological scenes. A man condemned to die might be costumed as Orpheus, the legendary musician who could charm wild animals with his lyre. Of course, the man had no such ability, and the animals would tear him apart while the crowd laughed at the dark parody. Another might be dressed as Prometheus, chained to a rock to have his liver eaten by an eagle. Except the eagle would be real, and the man's screams genuine. The variety of animals displayed in these morning spectacles was staggering. Bears from Britain and Germany, lions and leopards from Africa, elephants from Asia, crocodiles from Egypt, even ostriches, giraffes, and hippopotamuses. Rome's far-flung empire provided access to creatures that most Romans would never otherwise see. The games were educational in a grotesque sort of way, teaching the populace about the world's biodiversity right before destroying examples of it. The sheer scale of animal slaughter during some games beggars belief. Titus's inaugural games killed 9,000 animals in 100 days. Trajan's Dacian triumph featured 11,000 animals slaughtered over 123 days. The Emperor Commodus personally killed 100 bears in a single day, shooting them with arrows from a safe position while demonstrating his supposedly superhuman prowess. The ecological impact must have been tremendous, with some species possibly driven to extinction in certain regions to supply Rome's insatiable appetite for exotic animals. Midday brought a shift in tone. The animal carcasses would be cleared away, the sand raked and refreshed. Then came the execution of criminals, the noxii. These spectacles varied in elaboration. Simple beheadings or stranglings might be performed en masse. Dozens of condemned criminals dispatched efficiently. More elaborate executions involved torture or creative methods of death designed to humiliate and terrorize. Some noxi were forced to fight each other, given weapons and told that the survivor might be spared. This was almost always a lie. The survivor would be executed anyway. But the false hope ensured the condemned men would actually fight rather than simply refusing to participate. These noon executions were considered the least interesting part of the day's program. Many spectators left during this time to get lunch, returning later for the afternoon's main event. That main event, of course, was the gladiatorial combat. The afternoon saw trained fighters, professional warriors who had spent years perfecting their craft, entering the arena to battle for survival, glory, and the crowd's adoration. The afternoon was what everyone had really come to see. The gladiators would enter in a formal procession, the pompa, marching around the arena perimeter while the crowd roared its approval or scorn. They wore their finest armor, polished to shine in the afternoon sun. Musicians played horns and drums, building tension and excitement. The gladiators would stop before the emperor's box, raising their weapons in salute. The phrase often associated with this moment, Ave Imperator, morituri te salutant, or Hail Emperor, those who are about to die salute you. was actually recorded only once in ancient sources, before a mock naval battle in 52 AD. Whether gladiators regularly spoke such words remains uncertain, though the sentiment captures something true about the ritual acknowledgement of the emperor's presence and authority. After the procession, the gladiators would be matched up according to the editor's plan. The editor, the sponsor of the games, had carefully arranged the pairings to create interesting contests. A heavily armed Murmillo might face a mobile Thraex. A Retiarius would square off against a Secutor. The pairings were announced, and gladiators came forward in turn. Before the real fighting began, there might be a prelude, a mock combat called a prelucio, using wooden weapons. This allowed the gladiators to warm up and gave the crowd a taste of the fighting styles that would soon be employed in earnest. Then the signal would be given, usually a trumpet blast, and the real combat would begin. Gladiatorial combat was not mindless brawling. It was skilled fighting between trained warriors, tactical contests where one mistake could mean death. The crowd watched with expert eyes, understanding the techniques, appreciating clever feints and aggressive advances. They shouted encouragement to their favorites, booed fighters who seemed cowardly or defensive. The psychological pressure was immense. When a gladiator was wounded or exhausted, unable to continue, he could signal his submission by dropping his weapon and raising a finger. The decision on his fate then passed to the editor and the crowd. The editor would gauge the crowd's reaction. If they wanted the defeated gladiator spared, they would wave handkerchiefs and shout, "Mite, let him go." If they wanted him killed, the crowd would signal death, though the exact gesture remains uncertain despite popular belief. The thumbs down gesture as a death sentence is likely a modern misinterpretation. Ancient sources describe the police verso, the turned thumb, but don't clearly specify which direction it turned. Modern scholars debate whether the death signal involved the thumb pointing up, down toward the chest, or in some other direction entirely. What we know with certainty is that the crowd's wishes held enormous weight, and emperors who consistently overruled popular judgment risked losing public support. If the verdict was death, the victorious gladiator was expected to dispatch his opponent quickly and cleanly, a single thrust to the throat or heart. A gladiator who died well, facing his end with courage and without begging, earned respect even in defeat. His body would be carried out through the Porta Libitinaria, while attendants raked fresh sand over the blood. If spared, the defeated gladiator would leave through the Porta Triumphalis, escorted by medical personnel who would treat his wounds. He'd fight another day, his life extended, but his fate unchanged. Every gladiator knew that eventually he would face an opponent he couldn't defeat, a day when the crowd's favor wouldn't save him. The victor received prizes, money certainly paid by the editor, sometimes gifts from wealthy spectators who admired his performance. The greatest gift, the ultimate prize, was the rudis, the wooden sword symbolizing freedom. But this was rare, granted only to exceptional gladiators who had compiled impressive records and captured the public's imagination. Most gladiators fought and fought and fought until their luck ran out and they died in the sand. Legends written in blood. Some gladiators transcended the arena, their names entering history not as anonymous fighters, but as individuals whose stories we can still tell. Spartacus, of course, is the most famous, though his fame comes from his rebellion rather than his combat record. But there were others whose achievements in the arena itself secured their legacy. Priscus and Varus, who fought at the Colosseum's inauguration in 80 AD, provided one of the most memorable contests in gladiatorial history. Both were expert fighters, matched evenly in skill and determination. They battled for hours, neither able to gain a decisive advantage. The crowd watched spellbound as these two warriors demonstrated the absolute peak of gladiatorial skill. Finally, exhausted, they simultaneously dropped their weapons and raised their fingers, each acknowledging that neither could defeat the other. The Emperor Titus faced a dilemma. The fight had been spectacular, the finest combat anyone had witnessed. But how do you judge such a contest? Both had fought magnificently. Both had shown courage and skill. Both deserved reward. Titus solved the problem by granting both fighters the rudies, declaring them both victors and both free. The crowd erupted in approval. This was the kind of magnanimity that made emperors popular, demonstrating that Roman values rewarded merit and courage, regardless of servile status. Flamma, a Syrian gladiator, compiled one of the most remarkable records in the arena's history. 21 victories, 9 draws, 4 defeats. He survived all 4 of his losses, each time earning the crowd's mercy. He was offered his freedom, the rudies, 4 separate times. 4 times he refused it, choosing to remain a gladiator. What drove this decision, we can only speculate. Perhaps he loved the arena, the combat, the crowd's adoration. It's possible he felt incapable of living any other life, or that violence had become so ingrained in his identity that peaceful existence seemed impossible. What evidence we have suggests Flamma died in the arena at age 30, his epitaph recording his unusual career and his repeated refusal of freedom. Marcus Attilius was unusual among gladiators in that he was apparently a volunteer, a free man who chose this life. Graffiti from Pompeii records his first victory over Hilaris, a gladiator with an impressive record of 14 wins. In his second known fight, Attilius defeated Lucius Ratius Felix, another veteran with 12 victories. For a novice to defeat 2 experienced gladiators in his first outings was extraordinary, and Attilius became an instant celebrity. What happened to him after these victories remains unknown. Perhaps he won his freedom. Perhaps he died in a later bout. The historical record preserves only fragments. Carpophorus was a bestiarius rather than a gladiator, but his feats in animal combat earned him legendary status. Ancient sources claim he killed 20 wild animals in a single exhibition, including lions, leopards, and bears. Other accounts credit him with fighting a rhinoceros, defeating it with a spear. These stories might be exaggerated. Roman writers loved to embellish tales of the arena, making heroes larger than life. But even if the numbers are inflated, Carpophorus clearly possessed extraordinary skill and courage to have his exploits remembered. Female gladiators, though rare, occasionally achieved recognition. The Halicarnassus relief, a marble sculpture from the 2nd century AD, depicts 2 female gladiators in combat. The inscription names them Amazon and Achillea, and records that they fought to an honorable draw, both released from the match. Archaeological evidence suggests these weren't unique cases. Women fought, though infrequently and controversially, drawing crowds curious to see women engage in behavior Roman society normally denied them. Then there's Commodus, the emperor who styled himself as a gladiator. Son of the philosopher emperor Marcus Aurelius, Commodus defied every expectation of imperial behavior by regularly appearing in the arena. This wasn't noble or brave. Commodus arranged his fights carefully, ensuring his opponents were handicapped or weakened. He fought animals from safe positions, using bows or spears while the creatures were constrained. He fought crippled gladiators who couldn't defend themselves adequately, then brutally killed them to the crowd's horror. Commodus's arena appearances degraded the imperial office. Romans expected their emperor to sponsor games, not to participate in them. Gladiators were infames, socially stigmatized, legally disabled. By fighting as a gladiator, Commodus lowered himself to their level, an unthinkable degradation of imperial dignity. The historian Dio Cassius records the Senate's horror, forced to watch their emperor disgrace himself while pretending to approve. Commodus collected enormous fees for his arena appearances, charged to the city's treasury, effectively forcing Rome to pay for the privilege of watching their emperor humiliate himself and the state. His obsession with the arena contributed to his downfall. On December 31st, 1920 AD, members of his inner circle, fearing for their own safety and disgusted by his behavior, arranged his assassination. He was strangled in his bath by a wrestler named Narcissus, ending one of the most bizarre reigns in Roman history. The social reality of blood. Understanding the social position of gladiators requires holding contradictory idea in tension. They were simultaneously celebrated and despised, admired and reviled. A successful gladiator might have thousands of fans, receive love letters from wealthy women, have his image reproduced on pottery and lamps throughout the city. But he was still infames, legally stigmatized, barred from political participation, socially unacceptable in polite company. This paradox fascinated the Romans themselves. The Christian writer Tertullian, living in the late 2nd century AD, captured it perfectly when he wrote about how Romans glorify them and they degrade and diminish them. Gladiators embodied Roman martial values, courage, discipline, skill in combat, willingness to face death. Yet their profession marked them as less than fully human in the eyes of Roman law and custom. The infamia attached to gladiators was legal as well as social. They couldn't serve in the army, hold public office, or testify in certain legal proceedings. Even if a gladiator won his freedom, the stigma remained. Former gladiators were marked men, forever associated with the arena's violence. This legal disability seems cruel, but it served a purpose in Roman society. It maintained clear boundaries between respectable and disreputable professions, ensuring that the men trained to kill for entertainment couldn't translate that training into political power. Yet Romans flocked to watch them, studied their techniques, memorized their records. Children played games imitating famous gladiators. Artists painted their portraits. Poets wrote verses about them. This cultural obsession with figures who were simultaneously celebrated and degraded reveals something deep about Roman psychology and social structure. The economic aspects of gladiatorial combat were substantial. The lanistae who owned gladiator schools could become wealthy. A single successful gladiator represented an investment that could generate enormous returns. The lanista would rent his fighters to editors, sponsoring games, negotiating fees based on the gladiator's fame and skill level. A novice hero might cost 1,000 sestertii to rent. A famous gladiator with a proven record could cost 15,000 sestertii or more. If the gladiator died, the editor had to compensate the lanista for the loss, sometimes paying as much as 100,000 sestertii for an exceptional fighter. The editors sponsoring games could spend staggering sums. Augustus's reforms had tried to cap spending, limiting what private citizens could spend on gladiatorial games to prevent them from bankrupting themselves or using the games to accumulate too much political power. But these limits were often ignored or circumvented. Julius Caesar had spent the equivalent of millions of modern dollars on his games in 65 BC, and later politicians and emperors matched or exceeded his extravagance. This money flowed through the Roman economy, supporting not just the gladiators and their owners, but entire industries. Weapon makers produced specialized equipment for different gladiator types. Armor smiths crafted helmets and shields. Trainers, medical personnel, veterinarians for the animals, laborers who maintained the amphitheaters, merchants who sold food at the games. All these people earned their living from the institution of the arena. The broader economic impact extended even further. Cities throughout the empire built amphitheaters, enormous construction projects requiring thousands of workers and vast quantities of building materials. The animals for the Venationes had to be captured in distant provinces, transported across seas and mountains, then housed and fed until the games. This created an international trade in exotic wildlife, with professional animal hunters operating from Britain to North Africa to the Middle East. The cost of all this spectacle was ultimately borne by the Roman state and economy. Emperors subsidized the games heavily, understanding that popular entertainment was cheaper than dealing with civic unrest. The policy of bread and circuses wasn't merely cynical. It was recognition that keeping a large urban population fed and entertained prevented the kind of instability that could topple governments. The games were expensive, but rebellion was far more costly. Religious elements, though diminished from the early days, never entirely disappeared. The games opened with sacrifices to the gods. Gladiators dedicated their weapons at shrines before combat. The execution of criminals during the midday interval retained the ancient character of human sacrifice, even if Romans officially denied that's what they were doing. The presence of the Vestal Virgins, those sacred priestesses, sanctified the games with religious authority. The gladiator's oath, that terrible vow to endure to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword, had religious overtones. It was a devotio, a dedication of one's life to a specific purpose. By swearing this oath, the gladiator placed himself under a kind of sacred obligation. Breaking such an oath would anger the gods, not just the lanista. This religious dimension helped explain why even free volunteers would submit to such a life. They weren't merely entering a profession. They were fulfilling a vow, discharging a religious obligation, the beginning of the end. The gladiatorial games reached their peak during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, but the seeds of their decline were already present. The economic burden of maintaining the spectacles grew increasingly heavy as the empire faced military challenges on multiple frontiers. Barbarian invasions, civil wars, political instability, all these demanded resources that had previously been spent on entertainment. The 3rd century AD, that period of crisis that nearly destroyed the empire, saw a marked decrease in the frequency and scale of gladiatorial games. But economics alone didn't kill the games. A new religious force was rising in the empire, one fundamentally opposed to the values the arena represented. Christianity, that Jewish sect that had begun as an obscure provincial cult, was spreading throughout the Roman world, and Christians found gladiatorial combat morally abhorrent. Christian opposition to the games had multiple dimensions. Tertullian, Writing around 200 AD, he attacked them as pagan human sacrifice disguised as entertainment. He argued that witnessing such violence corrupted the soul, that taking pleasure in death and suffering was spiritually harmful. The Christian church father Augustine wrote movingly about the psychological dangers of the arena, describing how even those who attended with reluctance found themselves swept up in bloodlust, shouting for deaths they had come intending to deplore. But Christian opposition went deeper than mere moral objections. The games were tied to pagan religious observances, dedicated to gods Christians believed were demons. They celebrated values antithetical to Christian teaching: violence rather than peace, domination rather than mercy, worldly glory rather than spiritual humility. To attend the games was to participate in pagan worship, to sanction values Christ had condemned. For the first 3 centuries of Christian history, this opposition meant little to Roman policy. Christians were a minority, often persecuted, sometimes executed in the very arenas they condemned. The irony was bitter. Christians denounced the games as murder, and Rome responded by making them part of the show, executing Christians during the midday interval or throwing them to beasts in the morning venationes. Everything changed when Constantine became emperor. In 312 AD, Constantine converted to Christianity after his victory at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, attributing his triumph to the Christian God. For the first time, the Roman Empire had a Christian emperor, and Constantine began shifting imperial policy to align with Christian values. In 325 AD, he issued legislation attempting to curtail gladiatorial combat, decreeing that criminals should work in the mines rather than fight in the arena. Constantine's legislation, however, proved ineffective. The games were too popular, too deeply embedded in Roman culture, too politically useful for emperors who needed to maintain public support. Constantine himself appears to have occasionally sponsored games, or at least failed to enforce his own decree consistently. The gladiatorial contests continued, though perhaps with somewhat reduced frequency. The empire's adoption of Christianity as the state religion under Theodosius I in 393 AD further pressured the games. Theodosius banned all pagan festivals, though the ludi continued in modified form. His son Honorius, emperor of the Western Roman Empire, issued another ban on gladiatorial combat in 399 AD. Like Constantine's ban, this decree was ignored. The games persisted, but the end was approaching. By the early 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was in terminal decline. Barbarian invasions had devastated provinces. The economy was collapsing. The political center could barely maintain control. In this context of civilizational crisis, the resources required for elaborate games simply weren't available. More importantly, the will to maintain them was eroding. Christianity had become the dominant religion, and each generation of Christians found the old pagan spectacles more alien, more disturbing. The traditional date for the end of gladiatorial combat in Rome is January 1st, 404 AD, though the circumstances surrounding this final ban remain somewhat unclear. According to the Christian chronicler Theodoret, writing decades after the events, a monk named Telemachus traveled from the eastern provinces to Rome. During gladiatorial games, Telemachus entered the arena and attempted to separate the fighters, calling for an end to the bloodshed in honor of the Christmas season. The accounts of what happened next vary considerably. Theodoret reports that the crowd, enraged at this interruption of their entertainment, stoned Telemachus to death. Other versions of the story, developed in later centuries, claim that a gladiator stabbed him or that guards killed him on orders. Some modern retellings, including one by President Ronald Reagan in 1984, romantically suggest the crowd fell silent and departed, moved by the monk's sacrifice, though this version appears to be a pious embellishment with no ancient source support. What seems reasonably certain is that around this time, Telemachus died in an arena attempting to stop the games, and Emperor Honorius subsequently issued legislation that effectively ended gladiatorial combat throughout the Western Empire. The monk was honored as a martyr, with his feast day commemorated on January 1st. Whether Honorius's decree was the direct result of Telemachus's death, or whether the martyrdom story was attached to legislation that had other motivations, remains a matter of scholarly discussion. What matters is that by 404 AD, gladiatorial combat in the traditional sense had ceased in Rome and throughout the Western territories. This doesn't mean all arena violence immediately ceased. Animal hunts, the Venationes, continued for some time longer, though with decreasing frequency and scale. The last well-documented Venationes in Rome appear to have occurred in the early 6th century during Ostrogothic rule. Executions of condemned criminals likely continued in various forms as well. But the trained gladiatorial combat, that elaborate blood sport that had been a fixture of Roman life for over 6.5 centuries, was finished. The gladiator schools closed. The fighters dispersed, their specialized skills no longer marketable. The equipment was melted down or discarded. An era had ended. The reasons for the game's end were complex and multifaceted. Christianity provided the moral framework for opposition, but economics and politics mattered too. The Western Empire in the 5th century was fighting for survival against barbarian invasions. Resources that might have maintained the games were desperately needed elsewhere. The gladiator schools had been expensive to maintain, and the empire could no longer afford them. There was also a generational shift in values. Romans who had grown up Christian, who had never known pagan rule, found the games increasingly alien and disturbing. The celebration of violence, the public execution of criminals, the casual slaughter of exotic animals, all this seemed barbaric to a Christianized society that at least nominally valued mercy and compassion. The games had been designed for a pagan worldview that saw life as cheap and violent death as potentially glorious. Christian theology insisted life was sacred, that every soul was valuable, that violence was deplorable rather than entertaining. The East, the Greek-speaking Eastern Roman Empire that would become Byzantium, had never been as enthusiastic about gladiatorial combat as the Latin West. Gladiatorial games had always been more popular in Italy and the western provinces. In the East, chariot racing was the preferred blood sport, and it continued long after gladiatorial combat ended. The Hippodrome in Constantinople hosted chariot races well into the medieval period, suggesting that it wasn't violence per se that Christianity opposed, but the specific form of violence represented by gladiatorial combat, the long decline of the arena. After 404 AD, the Colosseum and other amphitheaters didn't immediately fall into ruin. They continued to serve various purposes, though not the ones they'd been built for. The last recorded Venationes in Rome appear to have occurred in the 520s AD, during the reign of Theodoric the Ostrogoth, who ruled Italy after the Western Empire's formal end in 476 AD. But these were modest affairs compared to earlier spectacles, lacking the resources and organization that had characterized the games at their height. As the Western Empire collapsed and Italy fell under barbarian rule, the great amphitheaters lost their official maintenance. No longer did the Roman state dedicate resources to their upkeep. The buildings began to deteriorate. Earthquakes, common in Italy, damaged structures that weren't being repaired. In 217 AD, lightning had caused a major fire in the Colosseum's wooden upper levels. This damage had been repaired under later emperors, but fires and earthquakes in the 5th and 6th centuries caused damage that was never fixed. The Colosseum became a quarry. The iron clamps that held the stone blocks together were pried out, the metal needed for weapons or tools. The marble seats were removed and repurposed for other buildings. Later, during the Renaissance, enormous quantities of travertine stone were taken from the Colosseum to build churches and palaces. St. Peter's Basilica, that greatest church of Christendom, was partly built from stone robbed from the pagan arena where Christians had once been martyred. The symbolism was probably intentional. During the Middle Ages, the Colosseum served various mundane purposes. Parts of it were converted into housing for the poor. Sections became workshops for craftsmen. The arcades on the ground floor were walled up and used as storage. Wealthy Roman families built fortifications into and around the structure, turning sections of it into medieval castles. The Frangipani family controlled parts of the Colosseum in the 12th and 13th centuries, using it as a fortress in their feuds with rival families. Animals took up residence too. Oxen and other livestock were stabled in the old chambers. Vegetation took root in cracks and crevices, watered by rain and nourished by accumulated soil. In 1844, a British botanist named Richard Deacon cataloged over 420 different plant species growing in the Colosseum, including some rare varieties found nowhere else in Rome. He speculated these might be descendants of plants whose seeds had arrived in the dung of exotic animals displayed in the ancient games. A living connection to those distant spectacles. The Christian Church gradually claimed the Colosseum as a sacred site. In 1744, Pope Benedict XIV prohibited any further removal of stone, declaring the Colosseum worthy of preservation in memory of Christians who had suffered martyrdom in Roman arenas. This papal protection probably saved the structure from complete destruction. He installed the Stations of the Cross around the arena, transforming it into a site of Christian pilgrimage. Every Good Friday, the Pope led processions through the Colosseum, commemorating Christ's Passion in a building that had once hosted pagan spectacles. Whether Christians were actually martyred specifically in the Colosseum, rather than in other Roman arenas, remains a matter of scholarly debate. The early Christian martyrdom accounts rarely specify exact locations. The Colosseum wasn't completed until 80 AD, after Nero's persecution of Christians in the 60s AD. While Christians were certainly executed in various Roman amphitheaters, the specific association of the Colosseum with Christian martyrdom may be more legendary than historical. Nonetheless, by the medieval period, this connection had become firmly established in popular belief, and the monument gained sacred significance in Christian tradition. The building's name itself evolved. Colosseum derives from the Colossus of Nero, that massive statue that had stood near the amphitheater. The amphitheater had originally been called the Flavian Amphitheater, after the Flavian dynasty that built it. But over centuries, Colosseum became the standard name, referencing the vanished statue rather than the vanished emperors. In the 8th century, the Venerable Bede wrote a prophecy that became famous. As long as the Colosseum stands, Rome shall stand. When the Colosseum falls, Rome shall fall. When Rome falls, the world shall fall. This is sometimes misquoted as referring to the statue rather than the building. but the prophecy captured a truth. The Colosseum had become Rome's most iconic monument, a symbol of the city's ancient grandeur and enduring presence. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical antiquity. Artists sketched the ruins, architects studied the building's design, learning from Roman engineering. But the Renaissance also brought more destruction, as wealthy patrons stripped the building of materials for new palaces and churches. This was the great age of Roman building projects. And the Colosseum was essentially an inexhaustible stone quarry conveniently located in the city center. The Romantic period of the 18th and 19th centuries transformed the Colosseum once again, this time into an object of aesthetic contemplation. Poets like Byron and Shelley wrote about its ruins, finding in them evidence of vanished glory and reflections on mortality and the passage of time. Byron's Childe Harold's Pilgrimage includes famous verses describing the Colosseum bathed in moonlight, a scene of melancholy beauty. The building became essential to the Grand Tour, that educational journey through Europe undertaken by wealthy young men. No visitor to Rome could skip the Colosseum. Artists painted it obsessively. The British painter J.M.W. Turner created several dramatic paintings of the Colosseum. The American Thomas Cole included it in his series The Course of Empire, using it to represent the stage of imperial glory before inevitable decline. Photographers, once that technology emerged, made the Colosseum one of their favorite subjects. The building appeared on thousands of postcards, travel posters, and advertisements, becoming perhaps the single most recognizable symbol of Rome and ancient history. The 19th century also saw the beginning of serious archaeological study. Rather than treating the Colosseum purely as a quarry or a romantic ruin, scholars began systematically excavating, documenting, and analyzing it. They discovered the Hypogeum in 1874, those underground chambers that had been buried under debris and centuries of accumulated soil. This discovery revolutionized understanding of how the games had been staged, revealing the sophisticated mechanical systems that had enabled spectacular effects. Archaeological work continued throughout the 20th century. The Italian dictator Mussolini, obsessed with evoking ancient Roman glory, sponsored restoration projects and cleared away medieval and modern structures that had grown up around the Colosseum. He wanted the monument to stand isolated, surrounded by open space, a symbol of the new fascist state's connection to ancient imperial Rome. This cleared space became an archaeological park, though it also destroyed centuries of historical layering. Modern restoration efforts accelerated after the Second World War. The Colosseum had suffered damage from bombing, and post-war Italian governments recognized the monument's importance to both national identity and the tourism industry. Engineers stabilized walls that were threatening to collapse. Archaeologists excavated more thoroughly. The Hypogeum was fully cleared and open to visitors in recent decades, allowing tourists to walk the same passages that gladiators had used to reach the arena. Today, the Colosseum is one of the most visited tourist attractions in the world, drawing approximately 6 to 7 million visitors annually in recent years. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized as one of the new 7 wonders of the world. The Italian government and various international organizations continue conservation work, fighting a constant battle against pollution, weathering, and the sheer weight of foot traffic from millions of tourists. The monument's cultural significance extends far beyond Italy. The Colosseum appears on the Italian 5-cent euro coin. It's been featured in countless films, video games, and other media. The word Colosseum has become generic, used for any large stadium or arena, even though these modern structures serve very different purposes than their ancient namesake. The gladiator's echo in modern culture. The gladiator's cultural influence persists in unexpected ways. Modern combat sports, from boxing to mixed martial arts, follow patterns established in the arena. Fighters are matched by weight class and style, just as gladiators were matched by type and armature. Audiences watch for dramatic confrontations between contrasting approaches, much as Romans enjoyed watching retiarii battle secutores. The promotion and marketing of fighters emphasizes personality and backstory, creating narratives around combat, just as Romans created narratives around their favorite gladiators. The film and television industry has repeatedly returned to gladiatorial themes. The 1960 film Spartacus, directed by Stanley Kubrick and starring Kirk Douglas, brought the slave revolt to mainstream audiences, though it took considerable liberties with historical fact. Ridley Scott's 2000 film Gladiator, starring Russell Crowe, became a cultural phenomenon, winning 5 Academy Awards and grossing over $460 million worldwide. The film's tagline, "What we do in life echoes in eternity," captured something of the Roman fascination with glory and remembrance. These films, while not historically accurate, have shaped how modern audiences envision gladiators in ancient Rome. Scott's Gladiator, in particular, influenced popular culture significantly, making gladiatorial combat seem more honorable, more heroic than it probably was. The film's protagonist, Maximus, is a noble general forced into slavery in gladiatorial combat, seeking revenge against the corrupt emperor who murdered his family. This narrative of the virtuous individual fighting against corrupt power resonates with modern audiences, but obscures the reality that most gladiators were slaves with no choice in their profession. Video games have embraced gladiatorial themes enthusiastically. Games like Gladiator, Road to Freedom, Colosseum, Road to Freedom, and sections of broader games like Rice, Son of Rome, allow players to experience simulated gladiatorial combat. These games range from historically grounded attempts at realism to fantastical interpretations that use gladiatorial settings as backdrops for entirely fictional stories. The gladiator appears in metaphor constantly. We speak of gladiatorial political contests, describing debates and elections as combat. Business culture uses military and combat metaphors extensively, and gladiatorial imagery fits naturally into this framework. Motivational speakers invoke gladiators as symbols of determination and courage. The image of the lone warrior facing overwhelming odds appeals to individualist ideologies, even though real gladiators were slaves serving masters' interests. Professional wrestling, that hybrid of sport and theater popular worldwide, but especially in the United States, shares DNA with gladiatorial combat. Wrestling matches follow predetermined scripts, though the physical actions are real and dangerous. Wrestlers develop distinctive personas, just as gladiator types had distinctive appearances and styles. The crowd's reaction matters enormously, determining which wrestlers become stars. The parallels to Roman amphitheater aren't exact, but they're stronger than casual observers might realize. Sports franchises often use gladiator imagery in their branding. Teams are called Spartans or Trojans. Stadiums are designed to evoke amphitheaters. Helmet designs sometimes reference Roman military equipment. This usage is interesting because it divorces gladiatorial imagery from its historical context of slavery and forced combat, instead emphasizing courage, skill, and competitive spirit. The academic study of gladiators has become a substantial field. Classical historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists have written hundreds of scholarly works analyzing gladiatorial combat from every conceivable angle. The economics of the games, their social function, their religious significance, their role in Roman political culture. Medical researchers have studied gladiator skeletons, revealing information about diet, injuries, and mortality rates. Experimental archaeologists have attempted to reconstruct gladiatorial equipment and fighting techniques, though necessarily without the actual combat. These scholarly investigations have complicated our understanding considerably. The simple narrative of doomed slaves fighting to the death has given way to more nuanced pictures. We now know that many gladiators were volunteers, that mortality rates varied considerably, that successful gladiators could achieve wealth and fame, that the games served multiple social functions beyond simple entertainment. This doesn't make the institution less troubling morally, but it makes it more comprehensible historically. The ethical questions surrounding gladiatorial combat remain relevant. Was it simple murder, as the Christian critics claimed? Or was it a legitimate form of entertainment that just happens to violate modern ethical sensibilities? Can we judge ancient practices by modern standards? Or must we accept that different cultures operate by different moral frameworks? These questions have no easy answers, but engaging with them seriously requires understanding the games in their historical context rather than simply condemning them from our contemporary vantage point. The Gladiator forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about entertainment, violence, and human nature. The Romans weren't monsters, at least not by their own standards. They were people who found meaning and pleasure in activities that we find abhorrent. Their society was structured in ways that treated human lives as having vastly different values depending on legal status, ethnicity, and social class. They believed that watching men kill each other could be both entertaining and morally improving, teaching lessons about courage and proper behavior. We've abolished gladiatorial combat, but have we truly transcended the impulses that created it? Modern societies still enjoy watching controlled violence in boxing, mixed martial arts, and football. We don't fight to the death anymore, at least not legally. But combat sports remain wildly popular. Is this fundamentally different from what the Romans enjoyed? Or is it merely a softened version of the same impulse? The question makes us uncomfortable, which is probably why we keep returning to gladiatorial themes in our culture, trying to make sense of this troubling mirror to our own violent entertainments. The architecture of memory. Stand today in the Colosseum's arena, looking up at the weathered walls that once echoed with 50,000 voices, and you're standing in a monument to human complexity. This building represents the height of Roman engineering achievement. A structure so well designed, it has survived 2,000 years, despite earthquakes, fires, stone robbing, and general neglect. The architectural principles embodied in its vaults and arches influenced builders for centuries, teaching lessons about structural mechanics that enabled Gothic cathedrals and eventually modern stadiums. But it's also a monument to a form of entertainment based on human suffering and death. A building designed to efficiently present violence to massive audiences. The sophisticated engineering that allowed animals to be raised from the hypogeum through trap doors served to enhance the spectacle of creatures being killed. The seating arrangements that demonstrated Roman social hierarchy seated people to watch executions and fights to the death. The acoustic design that ensured everyone could hear the combat also ensured they could hear the screams of the dying. This duality makes the Colosseum endlessly fascinating and deeply troubling. We can appreciate the engineering while condemning the purpose. We can study the social functions while acknowledging the human cost. We can recognize the games as historically significant while finding them morally reprehensible. The underground chambers, the hypogeum that visitors now walk through, are particularly evocative. These dim corridors, these small chambers, were where gladiators waited before their fights, knowing that some of them wouldn't return. Where animals paced in cages, sensing the violence that awaited them above. Where workers operated the machinery that elevated performers to the arena floor. The hypogeum is literally the underworld, the realm beneath the visible spectacle, where the unglamorous reality of the games was hidden from the audience's sight. Modern technology has given us new ways to understand and visualize the Colosseum. Laser scanning has created precise three-dimensional models of the structure, allowing researchers to analyze its dimensions and construction with unprecedented accuracy. Computer simulations have recreated how the velarium would have looked when deployed, how the hypogeum's elevators functioned, how the crowd would have filled the seating areas. Virtual reality applications let people experience the Colosseum as it appeared in its prime, walking through reconstructed chambers and sitting in simulated crowds. These technological approaches complement traditional archaeological methods. Excavations continue to reveal new information. In recent years, archaeologists have focused on the structures surrounding the Colosseum, including the Ludus Magnus and the other gladiator schools. They've studied the infrastructure that supported the games, the animal menageries, the armories, the medical facilities. Each discovery adds detail to our understanding of how this massive entertainment complex functioned. Conservation remains an ongoing challenge. The Colosseum is made primarily of travertine limestone, which is relatively durable but not immune to weathering. Air pollution from Rome's traffic causes acid rain that slowly dissolves the stone. Vibrations from passing vehicles, especially heavy trucks, cause microfractures. The sheer number of tourists creates wear on surfaces. The Italian government has invested heavily in conservation, with recent projects funded by private donors, including the luxury fashion house Tod's, which contributed 25 million euros for cleaning and restoration work, completed in 2016. The question of how to present the Colosseum to the public remains contentious. Should it be preserved as a ruin, maintaining the romantic quality that has captivated visitors for centuries? Or should sections be reconstructed to help visitors understand how it originally functioned? Limited reconstruction has occurred, including rebuilding a portion of the arena floor to give visitors a sense of the space's original configuration. But extensive reconstruction remains controversial, with some arguing it would destroy the monument's authenticity as a genuine ancient structure. The ethical dimensions of displaying and celebrating a structure dedicated to violence create uncomfortable tensions. Tourist authorities want to attract visitors and generate revenue. But celebrating the Colosseum too enthusiastically might seem to glorify or trivialize the suffering that occurred there. The solution has been to present the monument as historically significant while acknowledging the problematic aspects of the spectacles it hosted. Informational materials now tend to emphasize the game's violence and the forced nature of gladiators' participation, rather than romanticizing combat and warrior virtue. The final lesson of the arena. The story of gladiators and the Colosseum is ultimately about human beings, their capacity for both magnificent achievement and tremendous cruelty. The Romans built structures that still stand 2,000 years later, demonstrating engineering brilliance that continues to impress. They created entertainment spectacles on a scale that wouldn't be matched again until modern times. They developed complex social institutions that supported these spectacles, creating entire industries around the production of violence. But they did all this while treating human life as disposable. as mere material to be consumed for entertainment. Slaves and condemned criminals died by the thousands for no purpose beyond amusing crowds. Even volunteer gladiators who chose this life were enslaved by their oaths and trapped in a profession that offered only marginal hope of eventual freedom. The exotic animals slaughtered in the morning venaciones represented biodiversity that could never be replaced, species driven toward extinction to satisfy Roman appetites for novelty. Yet the gladiators themselves demonstrated remarkable courage and skill. Facing death repeatedly, they developed not just fighting techniques, but psychological resilience that most of us can barely imagine. The ancient sources record gladiators meeting their ends with equanimity, dying well, according to Roman standards that valued facing death without fear or complaint. Whether we approve of these values or not, the individuals who embodied them were genuinely impressive in their ability to confront mortality and maintain dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. The gladiators' paradoxical position in Roman society, celebrated and degraded, admired and excluded, reveals fundamental tensions in human nature and social organization. We want to believe that good societies honor good people, that virtue is rewarded and vice punished. But Rome honored gladiatorial virtue while ensuring gladiators remained socially marginalized. The courage that made a gladiator admirable was the same courage that made him dangerous, and Rome simultaneously celebrated and feared that danger. The end of gladiatorial combat demonstrates how cultural values can shift even in societies that seem unchanging. Romans sponsored these games for approximately 650 to 700 years, from their first recorded occurrence in 264 BC to their final prohibition around 404 AD. For most of that period, the game seemed as permanent as the empire itself, an essential feature of Roman civilization. But values did change. Christianity provided an alternative ethical framework that eventually made the games unsustainable. Economic pressures and political instability accelerated their decline. The institution that had seemed eternal simply ended, banned by emperors and forgotten by later generations. This should give us pause when considering our own cultural practices. What institutions that seem permanent today might be viewed as barbaric by our descendants? What forms of entertainment, what economic systems, what social hierarchies that we accept as normal might future generations condemn? The Romans thought their games would last forever. They were wrong. We should be humble about our own certainties. The physical monument of the Colosseum endures, but its meaning keeps changing. For Romans, it was a symbol of imperial power and generosity, the emperors giving the people spectacular entertainment. For medieval Christians, it became a site of martyrdom, sacred to those who died for their faith. For Romantic poets, it was a melancholy reminder of vanished glory and the inevitable decay of human achievement. For modern tourists, it's a connection to the ancient world, a tangible link to history that they can walk through and photograph. All these interpretations contain truth, but none captures the complete reality. The Colosseum is too complex, too layered with meaning and history, to be reduced to any single interpretation. It's a testament to human achievement and human cruelty. Its beautiful architecture serving ugly purposes. It's a monument to empire and to the individuals who died within its walls. It's both more impressive and more disturbing than any single narrative can capture. The gladiator schools are gone now, reduced to scattered ruins and archaeological remains. The ludus magnus is visible from the street, with partial excavated remains accessible to view, though access to the site has varied over the years depending on conservation work and archaeological projects. Its training arena where 3,000 Romans once watched fighters prepare lies partially exposed to modern observers. The underground tunnel connecting it to the Colosseum has been severed by modern construction. That direct link between school and arena, broken forever. But stand on the Colosseum's arena floor on a quiet morning before the tourists arrive, and you can almost feel the presence of those who came before. The gladiators who walked this sand knowing they might die. The condemned criminals praying for mercy that wouldn't come. The exotic animals confused and terrified, far from their native lands. The crowds roaring approval or condemnation, caught up in the collective psychology of mass entertainment. The emperors in their box, using these spectacles to reinforce their power and maintain social order. They're all gone now. Dead for nearly 2,000 years. Their bones long since turned to dust. But their story remains, preserved in historical texts, in archaeological remains, in the monument itself. The story of what humans will do to other humans for entertainment, for political advantage, for the simple pleasure of watching skilled combat. The story of how societies justify violence and exploitation by embedding them in complex cultural and religious frameworks that make the intolerable seem normal, even admirable. The gladiators fought for life, for freedom, for glory, and most of all, simply because they had no choice. Some achieved the fame they sought. Most died anonymous, remembered by no one, their names never recorded. But collectively, they created a legacy that still fascinates and troubles us, forcing us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature and civilized values. The Colosseum stands, weathered but enduring, a monument to everything the gladiators were and everything they suffered. Every year, millions of people from around the world walk through its arches, stand on its arena floor, look up at its walls, and imagine what it must have been like when the crowds roared and the fighters battled and the blood soaked into the sand. They're connecting with history, with the ancient world, with a time when human life was cheaper, but perhaps individual courage mattered more. The games are over. The gladiators are gone. But their echo remains, resonating through the centuries, reminding us of the complex, contradictory nature of human achievement and human cruelty. In the end, that might be the greatest lesson the arena teaches. That we humans are capable of both magnificent creation and terrible destruction, often at the same time, often in the same place, often motivated by the same impulses. So as we close this journey through the history of gladiators and the Colosseum, remember that you've been exploring not just ancient history, but a mirror held up to human nature itself. The questions raised by gladiatorial combat, about violence and entertainment, about the value of human life, about courage and cowardice, about how societies justify practices their descendants find abhorrent, these questions remain relevant. The gladiators may be gone, but the impulses that created them and the questions they raise are very much still with us. If you enjoyed this deep exploration of ancient history, please consider subscribing to Ancient Curiosities. Hit that like button, share this video with anyone fascinated by the ancient world, and leave a comment telling us what historical topics you'd like us to explore next. We have so many more forgotten worlds and ancient civilizations to discover together. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, And remember that history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding who we are today.